My lawyer father made our entire family share pre-chewed food mouth to mouth for every single meal because he said families who used plates were emotionally dead. When I secretly ate a granola bar at school by myself, he melted down all our forks and spoons in the backyard while forcing us to watch. After CPS tried to intervene, he used forged medical documents to get us back, then revealed his own mother had died from the same feeding ritual he was now imposing on us. He believed that eating separately was the first step toward spiritual starvation. Every bite of food had to be pre-chewed and passed mouth to mouth between family members following the order of birth rank. My mother called it the chain of nourishment and insisted that families who used plates and forks were already emotionally dead to each other. My father enforced the ritual with religious obsession. He removed all utensils from the house and melted the rest in a fire pit while we stood by helplessly. Meals took hours. The food passed down the line. Dad chewed first, then passed it to Mom, who passed it to each child in descending age order. By the time it reached me, the youngest, it was a cold, saliva-soaked paste. We sat in a tight circle on the floor, knees touching, heads inclined inward. My father would place food in his mouth and chew exactly 30 times while we counted aloud. Then my mother would open her mouth like a baby bird. The wet, intimate sound of food transfer became the soundtrack of my childhood. When I started school and saw other kids with lunchboxes, I was confused. I asked my teacher why everyone was eating wrong. That's when I realized normal families don't share pre-digested food. So I snuck a granola bar from a friend and ate it alone in the bathroom. My first solo bite in 7 years. The crunch felt like rebellion. My father found the wrapper in my jacket pocket. That night, he sat us down and for the first time fully explained his theory. He brought out laminated medical diagrams of digestive systems. "A family that doesn't share enzymes can't share love," he said. "Every separate meal creates a rift in the cellular bond." He showed us photo albums of divorced couples and claimed they all ate off separate plates. Serial killers, he insisted, had always dined alone as children. After my granola bar betrayal, mealtimes became even more rigid. My father began inspecting our mouths before and after school for residue. He installed cameras in the kitchen to make sure the chain was never broken. My older brother, Isaac, developed chronic stomach infections from the bacteria, but Dad said that was just our bodies harmonizing gut flora. When my sister, Naomi, got braces, her orthodontist said she couldn't participate in the ritual anymore due to choking risk. My father made her remove them with pliers in front of all of us, her mouth bleeding, while he delivered a lecture about choosing metal over family. She still can't chew properly. Friends stopped inviting me to birthday parties once they realized I couldn't eat cake. I told teachers I had severe allergies to explain why I never bought school lunch. Dating was impossible. How do you tell someone that kissing them would contaminate the family food chain? When I turned 16 and got a job at McDonald's, I thought I could finally eat like a normal person during my breaks. But my father began showing up, sitting silently in the corner booth. One day, I took a bite of burger alone, just one bite, and he leapt to his feet, screaming that I was poisoning myself with sterile food. The next day, during the lunch rush, he returned, this time with my mother and siblings. He grabbed food from customers, chewed it, and tried to spit it into my mother's mouth while yelling about proper nourishment. When people screamed and backed away, he began spitting chewed-up Big Macs at strangers, shouting that he was trying to save them from spiritual starvation. Security called the police. He clutched a terrified child trying to demonstrate the correct feeding method. He'd brought a briefcase full of documentation, feeding charts dating back 15 years, temperature logs, bacterial cultures, photos of our feeding circle at every meal, all annotated with saliva bonding notes and transfer timing. When the health department investigated our home, they found no utensils, no dishes, but a circle worn deep into the kitchen floor where we had knelt for every meal. Notebooks filled with records of every bite I'd stolen from the chain.
But there was one incredibly important detail they overlooked. Our dad was a respected attorney who knew exactly how to twist the rules when it suited him. It wasn't long before my siblings and I were back under his control. I sat in Dad's car outside the CPS office, watching him adjust the rearview mirror so he could monitor all 3 of us in the back seat. Mom clutched grocery bags filled only with soft foods, applesauce, yogurt, mushy vegetables. No utensils, of course. The social worker had just finished listing the terms of our return: weekly check-ins, regular medical evaluations, proper nutrition. Dad had smiled politely and pulled out a folder from his briefcase, calmly explaining that our family's alternative nutritional therapy was protected under religious freedom statutes. At the pharmacy drive-thru, Dad ordered antibiotics for my brother Jonah while telling the puzzled pharmacist that true family wellness demanded unified treatment. The pharmacist furrowed his brow at the prescriptions, all under Dad's name, even though they were clearly for different people. His law degree had come in handy for knowing exactly which forms to fill out and which doctors would sign off without asking too many questions. My phone buzzed, my manager at McDonald's asking when I'd be back. Dad watched through the rearview mirror as I typed, "Family emergency, can't come back." His eyes caught mine in the reflection. Who requires your attention more than family? The phone suddenly felt like a brick in my lap. My sister's friend's mom called about a sleepover they'd planned weeks earlier. Dad took the phone from her and, in his polished courtroom voice, explained that our family was undergoing an essential bonding period following a misunderstanding with child welfare services. The woman fell quiet as he described how external interference had nearly dismantled our sacred family unit. When he hung up, my sister Leah just stared out the window, her jaw clenched from the damage the pliers had done. Back home, Dad immediately began reinstalling the kitchen cameras. Trust is earned through transparency, he declared, drilling new mounts into the walls. But these cameras were different, smaller, hidden behind air vents and inside light fixtures. The old ones had been visible, placed on tripods. These were invisible, made to fool any future inspectors. Mom served our first meal back together, overcooked pasta that barely needed chewing. Her hands trembled as she opened her mouth for Dad's chewed transfer. That familiar, wet sound echoed through the kitchen again. I noticed she had lost more weight during the separation. Her cheekbones jutted out sharply beneath her skin. Jonah vomited mid-chain, his throat too inflamed to handle the process. But Dad didn't stop. He insisted we continue, saying that contaminated food was part of our commitment to healing. The bacteria will strengthen our bond. We're rebuilding our cellular connection after the state tried to sever it. Mom's eyes went vacant as she accepted the tainted bite. Before Dad could confiscate my McDonald's uniform, I discreetly pocketed a plastic spoon from my locker, the one I'd used to sneak bites in the break room. While he burned my clothes in the backyard, declaring them polluted by industrial food residue, I slipped into the bathroom and hid the spoon inside a sanitary pad wrapper, the only place he'd never look. Dad arranged family therapy with a woman named Darlene, a counselor who'd lost her license 3 years ago. She now ran a home practice offering alternative healing and only took cash. During our first session, she nodded approvingly as Dad explained our feeding rituals, calling them beautiful examples of boundary dissolution. He mentioned casually that she'd been decertified for controversial therapeutic practices, which, he said, made her the perfect guide for families like ours, families who rejected the divisiveness of conventional psychology. When the school counselor called about our long absence, Dad put her on speaker and motioned for us to speak. We repeated the script he drilled into us. We're receiving home care for medical issues. When she pressed for specifics, he jumped in, citing privacy laws and warning of legal action if the school continued to harass us during a medical crisis. His voice held the weight of a man who knew exactly which statute to wield as a weapon. Later that night, I found Leah crouched in the bathroom, using her finger to scoop out toothpaste, the only thing she could safely eat on her own.
She'd squeezed half the toothpaste tube into her mouth, her damaged teeth barely managing even that. When she saw me standing in the doorway, she didn't stop. We both understood. This was the only act of rebellion she had left. The next morning, Dad announced a new rule. All children were now required to record daily video journals expressing gratitude for family preservation. He set up a camera in the living room where we had to film ourselves giving testimony about how the feeding chain had saved us from the sterile isolation of foster care. These videos, he explained, would serve as evidence if the state ever tried to interfere again. Right on schedule, the CPS caseworker arrived for our mandatory check-in. Dad handed her a medical document claiming we had a rare genetic condition that necessitated specialized feeding. The letterhead read Riverside Medical Center, but I recognized the watermark. It was from Dad's own law office stationery. When the caseworker held it up to the light, The truth was visible in the faint texture of the paper, but she only nodded and added it to her folder. Jonah's girlfriend had been texting all day, worried. Dad confiscated his phone and replied to her himself, claiming that Jonah needed space to heal with family. He had studied Jonah's texting habits, his abbreviations, his emojis, and mimicked them convincingly. The girlfriend's messages grew more desperate, then finally stopped altogether after a final message from Dad. Family comes first. Always. During the lunch chain, Mom broke down. "I can't taste anything anymore," she sobbed through a mouthful of food. Her voice was thick, muffled. Dad immediately launched into a lecture about emotional toxins, claiming her negativity was poisoning our nutritional energy. He ordered her to continue the transfer. Her tears mixed into the pre-chewed food as she passed it on. Later that day, a neighbor mentioned seeing us at the window and said we looked pale. That afternoon, Dad installed reflective film over all the windows, saying we'd developed UV sensitivity from the therapy. Now no one could see in. The house grew dimmer, quieter, more isolated. The cameras watched everything, and the world outside vanished behind silvered glass. Leah managed to scratch a message into the fogged bathroom mirror while showering. "Check Mom's old recipe box." The steam evaporated before I could respond or ask what she meant, but I remembered that box. It had sat forgotten on the top pantry shelf since before the feeding rituals began. To mark our successful custody reunion, Dad brought home a store-bought cake. We were required to share it mouth to mouth as he filmed it. The frosting melted and thinned with saliva as it passed between us. "Wider," he directed. "Smile. Show how happy you are to be home." We tried to obey. The camera captured our distorted, unnatural expressions. Leah struggled not to gag. Her ruined teeth couldn't handle the sweetness. The school principal called next about our prolonged truancy, but Dad had already prepared his response. He claimed we'd developed a rare autoimmune disorder requiring strict environmental isolation. When the principal hesitated, Dad produced medical quarantine papers, more forgeries, complete with embossed seals and signatures. He'd chosen a disorder obscure enough to avoid scrutiny, but not extreme enough to justify hospitalization. Meanwhile, I found out Dad had actually billed CPS for his legal consultation during their own investigation into our family. He charged $500 an hour to explain why their intervention was legally inappropriate. The invoice sat proudly on his desk, marked "paid" by the county. My final paycheck from McDonald's came in the mail. Dad took it and deposited the funds into the Family Wellness Fund, a bank account he alone controlled. Individual finances create division. Everything earned belongs to the unit. The account was solely in his name. Mom's Aunt Clara came to visit, notified by a neighbor and concerned about Mom's drastic weight loss and distant stare. Dad greeted her warmly and explained that Mom was in the middle of a speaking fast prescribed by our alternative therapist. Periods of silence, he said, were meant to purify the soul's communication channels. When Clara looked at Mom for confirmation, Mom simply nodded, eyes hollow. Clara noticed the shaking hands, the sharp bones beneath her sister's skin, but Dad's voice remained calm, persuasive. His explanations were smooth, effortless. He blended legal jargon with wellness speak so seamlessly that genuine concern sounded like ignorance. That night, Jonah tried to escape through his bedroom window, but Dad had already nailed it shut, claiming it was for climate control efficiency. The nails were painted to match the window frame, invisible unless you were searching for them. Jonah's fingers bled as he tried to pry them loose. The next day, Dad announced a new ritual. All medication would now be pre-chewed and shared, just like our food, to ensure full absorption through love, he said. He demonstrated with one of Mom's anxiety pills, grinding it between his molars before passing the bitter pulp into her mouth. Pharmaceutical companies design pills to be swallowed in isolation, he explained, but medicine works best when it's bonded with family enzymes. The chain of medication would begin immediately. The following morning, my best friend's mom showed up unannounced. She was a nurse at the local hospital and had grown concerned after not seeing me at school for weeks. I watched from the hallway as Dad met her at the door, radiating charm. He spoke confidently about our family's medical condition, handing her the forged documents he'd spent hours perfecting. She studied them, then glanced toward me. Dad shifted to block her line of sight, continuing his explanation in memorized medical terms. She commented that she'd never heard of such a condition. He replied that it was recently discovered and misunderstood by mainstream doctors. When she left, she told him he was one of the most devoted parents she'd ever met.
From the upstairs window, I saw her pause beside her car, glancing back. Leah pressed her face against the glass, mouthing something desperately, but the new reflective film made her invisible from the outside. That afternoon, Dad gathered us in the living room with a stack of dictionaries. He announced our next assignment, essays on the dangers of independence, but we could only use words he had personally approved. He flipped through the dictionaries, crossing out words in thick black marker. Freedom, escape, help, alone, gone. We spent hours constructing robotic paragraphs about the virtues of family unity using whatever was left. Leah's essay was just 20 words, repeated in different combinations. Jonah's was about digestive harmony and cellular interdependence. I wrote about the beauty of shared nutrition. Dad stood behind me as I worked, occasionally pointing to correct words I should include. While searching his study for more approved vocabulary, I noticed the filing cabinet was left unlocked. Inside, I found a folder labeled Evidence of Corruption. It contained years' worth of our texts, screenshots of private conversations between me, Jonah, and Leah, messages where we'd begged each other to stay strong, where we questioned Dad's rules and wondered if other families really used plates. Sticky notes in Dad's handwriting annotated everything. One beside a message from Leah asking if people actually ate separately read, "Contamination from school environment, increase isolation protocols." That evening, during the feeding circle, my period started unexpectedly. I shifted in place, feeling the warmth spread. Dad noticed. "Remain still," he said flatly. "Family bonding must not be interrupted by bodily functions." I sat silently as the chain continued, the familiar wet sounds of chewed food passing from mouth to mouth, blending with my growing shame. By the time the ritual ended hours later, I had bled through my clothes onto the floor. The stain darkened the worn circle where we always sat, now marked forever. Mom saw and started to move toward me, but Dad's glare stopped her cold. He made me scrub the floor myself while delivering a lecture about individual shame being another form of separation. Later, Dad obtained the security footage from the McDonald's incident through a legal request. He played it for us on repeat. In the grainy recording, I was visibly crying, but he insisted those were tears of joy, relief at being freed from my addiction to industrial food. He paused the video frequently, analyzing his technique like a teacher reviewing performance. Every person who flinched or turned away, he said, wasn't reacting in disgust, but in fear. They're afraid of true intimacy. They chose spiritual death over nourishment.
Dad filed the homeschool paperwork the following week, naming Mom as our primary educator. She hadn't spoken of her own volition in 3 days, communicating only through nods and small gestures that Dad had approved. The official documents claim she was teaching us advanced biology with a focus on digestive systems and family nutrition. In reality, we spent hours copying passages from Dad's handwritten notebooks about enzymatic bonding and cellular unity. Mom sat silently nearby while we worked, occasionally pointing out misspelled words with a trembling finger. Desperate for a way out, I remembered the hidden spoon. That night, I retrieved it from its hiding spot in the period pad wrapper and used it to swallow a handful of Jonah's antibiotics. I hoped the pills would make me sick enough to require hospitalization. Maybe that would mean freedom. Swallowing them without water scraped my throat raw, but I forced them down. I waited for symptoms, anything. But Dad had already noticed the medication bottle was low during his nightly count. He forced Jonah to vomit into a bowl and examined it carefully to confirm no pills were missing. When the numbers didn't add up, he began searching our rooms one by one. He didn't find the spoon, but he knew someone had taken the pills. Leah's rebellion took a different form. Before our isolation, she had started teaching herself sign language using library books. One afternoon, Dad caught her practicing in the bathroom mirror, her fingers moving in careful patterns he didn't recognize. He declared hand gestures a form of gestural contamination and banned all non-essential movement during meals. We were required to sit perfectly still, hands flat on our knees, only moving to pass and receive food. Leah's fingers twitched with suppressed language. The alternative therapist came for our next mandated session. She observed us quietly, scribbling notes about what she called our beautiful fusion. In our one-on-one meeting, she asked how I felt about the feeding chain.
I tried to bring up the infections, the weight loss, the isolation. She nodded with practiced empathy and later reported to Dad that I was showing resistance patterns and incomplete integration. Her solution? More intensive bonding rituals. Dad paid her in cash, counting out the bills from the Family Wellness Fund, which included my final McDonald's paycheck. Later, he played us an old audio recording. Mom's voice, years younger, filled the room. She spoke about the feeding ritual as a beautiful tradition that brought families closer. But if you listened carefully, you could hear the strain underneath her words, the coached cadence, the way every phrase sounded rehearsed, carefully curated for legal defense. He'd been recording her all along, stockpiling evidence of her voluntary participation. One evening, a pizza delivery driver showed up by mistake. Wrong house. Dodd opened the door and immediately launched into a sermon about the spiritual diseases carried by outside food. The driver stood on the porch, confused, holding the warming bag, while Dad explained how industrial food preparation severed emotional bonds. When the driver tried to leave, Dodd followed him down the driveway, still talking. The driver later reported it as a weird encounter to his manager. Odd, but not quite threatening enough to involve the police. Meanwhile, Jonah's infection spread. Swelling appeared around his neck, his lymph nodes visibly inflamed. Dad refused to take him to a doctor. Instead, he treated it with pre-chewed herbs from the backyard garden. He documented what he called an alternative medicine breakthrough, photographing Jonah's neck daily and claiming the swelling meant the toxins were leaving his body. The herbs were bitter, and Dad's saliva only made it worse. Jonah gagged during the chain, but Dad insisted this was proof the healing process had begun. He called pharmaceutical antibiotics a lie, a dangerous crutch that would destroy the delicate bacterial harmony of our family. I discovered that Dad had begun sleeping in the kitchen. His pillow was wedged behind the refrigerator, and a folded blanket rested neatly in the pantry. He was guarding the house against nutritional betrayal, making sure no one could sneak food at night. Sometimes I'd hear him pacing, checking the cameras, counting the food, scribbling in his ledgers. One afternoon, he made an unexpected offer. Each of us would be allowed one individual meal, one, if we signed a contract affirming that the feeding chain was voluntary. The document stated we chose to participate out of love and spiritual unity. They included clauses barring us from speaking to anyone about our family's rituals, promising never to seek legal help, and acknowledging that we understood and accepted the sacred necessity of shared consumption.
Leah reached for the pen, desperate for a single independent bite, but I caught her gaze and gave a small shake of my head. She froze. Dad noticed the exchange immediately and, without a word, made a note in his growing documentation. The next day, he announced a new plan, an intensive family immersion weekend at a cabin he had rented 3 hours away. It would be dedicated to purification and recommitment to the feeding chain, free of outside interference. As we packed, I remembered Leah's message scratched in the mirror steam. Check Mom's old recipe box. While Dad supervised Jonah's packing, I slipped into the pantry and climbed to the highest shelf. Dust coated everything. Hidden behind a row of long-forgotten canning jars was the box. I pulled it down. Inside, beneath faded recipe cards, lay a slim notebook in Mom's handwriting. The pages documented everything. Dad's slow but deliberate escalation, beginning with shared meals and spiraling into the nightmare we now lived. The final entry, dated just before the feeding chain became mandatory, read, "I should have protected them, but if I leave, he'll use them to prove his theories. At least if I stay, I can minimize the damage." It changed everything. The notebook revealed Mom had once resisted. When Dad first proposed a feeding ritual, she tried to leave, but he'd threatened her with legal action. With his law degree, he knew how to weaponize custody law, how to frame her as unstable. He'd isolated her from her family, convinced her that no court would grant custody to a mother who abandoned her children. Each entry grew shorter, weaker.
Eventually, all that remained were notations of compliance. Leah found me reading it and quietly revealed her own secret. She had been recording Dad's late-night monologues using an old iPod Shuffle hidden in her retainer case. Hours of him rambling while he thought we were asleep, about family unity, about his own upbringing, about the feeding chain saving us from emotional extinction. It was the truth, finally. Then Mom's sister, Aunt Clara, returned, this time with official paperwork, a court order for a wellness check. Dad examined the document carefully, then retrieved another, a medical power of attorney, supposedly signed by Mom. He claimed she had granted him full authority over all family medical decisions due to her anxiety. Aunt Clara studied the signature. It was shaky, uneven. Dad explained it had been signed during a particularly difficult period, but assured her it was fully legal. She left without seeing us, but from the window she looked up, locked eyes with me, and mouthed, "I'm not giving up." The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any road or neighbors, total isolation. Upon arrival, Dad declared we would enter a purification period. For the next 3 days, we would consume nothing but water, passed mouth to mouth, to cleanse ourselves and strengthen our unity. The hunger hit immediately. By the second day, I could barely stand. My legs trembled with weakness. Dad said that hunger revealed our truest bonds, that nothing was more sacred than shared thirst. That evening, I faked a fainting spell. I collapsed during the water chain, letting my body go limp. Dad rushed to me, initiating mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. He held my face, lips pressed to mine, lecturing all the while about dramatic manipulation tactics. His breath reeked of coffee and food. He'd been eating, secretly, alone, while forcing us through starvation. The betrayal scorched deeper than the hunger ever could. Later, Jonah stumbled upon Dad's briefcase and opened it. Inside were documents, custody agreements, and legal drafts for children that didn't even exist yet. Dad had already written contracts for future grandchildren, plans for the feeding chain to extend across generations, visiting rights dependent on ritual participation, clauses about maintaining digestive unity across households. A sheriff showed up the next morning. Aunt Clara had called in a wellness check. Dad answered the door with his usual calm. He showed the sheriff the same forged medical documents, spoke in that careful, confident tone. The sheriff looked at our faces, pale, gaunt, hollow, but said nothing definitive. Unusual parenting choices aren't illegal, he explained. Without evidence of physical harm, parents have the right to raise their kids according to their beliefs. He left with a warning about wasting law enforcement time. Leah's condition deteriorated fast. Starved and dehydrated, she began hallucinating. She called Dad by a different name, his estranged brother's name. And something in Dad's expression shifted.
Dad's usual grip on control began to crack. He spoke about his brother, how he had chosen isolation over family, how he died alone in a tiny apartment and wasn't found for weeks. The feeding chain would have saved him, Dad said, if only he'd understood that eating alone leads to spiritual starvation. That night, Mom tried to sneak us crackers while Dad slept. She crept through the cabin, pressing a small stack into Leah's trembling hands, but Dad had anticipated the betrayal. He was awake, watching from the shadows. When he caught her, he forced her to chew the crackers slowly, then pass the paste from mouth to mouth while he observed. "This is a lesson in honesty," he said. "Betrayal within the family is worse than contamination from outside." A few days later, my old McDonald's manager showed up at the cabin. He had tracked the location through the vacation rental website after days of unanswered texts and missed shifts. Dad met him at the door, immediately threatening legal action for harassment. But through the window, the manager saw enough. Our gaunt faces, the way Jonah's hands shook, Leah half-conscious on the couch. He left quickly, but not before saying, "This isn't over." He kept his word.
He contacted Adult Protective Services and reported concerns about Mom specifically, her vacant stare, the visible weight loss. But the system responded that unusual family dynamics weren't considered abuse in the absence of direct violence. Emotional manipulation and psychological control fell into legal gray areas. Dad declared that Mom needed intensive correction for her betrayal with the Crackers. He announced that we would participate in her rehabilitation as a united front, demonstrating solidarity by addressing her weakness together. The details of that correction hollowed her out completely. Her eyes dimmed. Her body followed orders, but her presence vanished. She became little more than a silent vessel for Dad's transfers. When we returned home from the cabin, Dad implemented a new rule: continuous feeding. Someone had to be eating at all times, day and night, to maintain the unbroken flow of nourishment. We were placed on rotating shifts, passing tiny bites in an endless chain. The skin at the corners of our mouths cracked and bled from overuse, but he recorded it all. Photographs, notes, proof, he said, of our dedication. Then Jonah's girlfriend arrived, with police. 2 officers stood at the doorway as she demanded to see him. Dad kept calm. He coached Jonah before answering, then stood just behind him as Jonah faced the officers and declared that he was staying of his own will. His girlfriend begged him to leave, told him he needed help, but Jonah recited Dad's script about the dangers of emotional independence, about how she was asking him to abandon his family for isolation. She left in tears. The officers shrugged. He's an adult, they said. We can't force him to leave. Next came a visit from one of my old teachers, concerned about our complete absence from school. Dad welcomed her in and presented an immaculate binder of homeschool documentation, lesson plans, syllabi, mock report cards. According to the paperwork, we were studying advanced biology, psychology, and family systems. In reality, it was all focused on digestive bonding and enzymatic sharing. Assignments included essays titled The Dangers of Eating Alone and Spiritual Decay Through Separation. The teacher was clearly unsettled by the curriculum's content, but admitted the documents were thorough. Leah's dental abscess had worsened. Her jaw had begun to swell, her skin tight with inflammation. Dad refused to let her see a dentist. Instead, he packed the abscess with garlic, chewed by him, of course. He claimed antibiotics were emotional crutches that weakened the body's trust in familial healing. As the infection spread, her face distorted, but Dad saw it differently. He took daily photos, noting evidence of toxins leaving the body. More proof, he insisted, that conventional medicine was a failure. Then, buried deep in Mom's old recipe box, I found something that changed everything. Photocopied pages from Dad's own medical records. They confirmed what we had always suspected. His mother had died during a feeding ritual decades earlier. Cause of death: malnutrition and infection. As a child, Dad had been hospitalized for the same practices. But instead of recognizing the danger, he'd rewritten the story in his mind, convinced that the ritual hadn't failed, only been performed incorrectly. He needed us to finish what she started, to prove that her death had meaning, that her methods were right. When Dad realized the recipe box was empty, he panicked. He began interrogating us one by one, using food deprivation as punishment. No one could participate in the feeding chain until someone confessed. I had hidden the photocopies in the same pad box where I once kept the spoon, the one place I knew he wouldn't search. But hunger wore down Jonah. Weak and delirious, he admitted seeing me near the pantry, even though he didn't know what I had taken. Aunt Clara filed for emergency custody, but Dad was ready. His legal filings came fast. Counter-motions for harassment, affidavits of stability, and of course, the videos and documents showing our voluntary participation. The same rehearsed clips, the smiling photos. The system faltered again.
The judge reviewing the case granted Dad's request for a restraining order against Aunt Clara. She was banned from the property, labeled a disruptive force interfering with our healing process. But beneath his calm demeanor, Dad's urgency had begun to show. I had seen his mother's death certificate in the photocopied records. It listed malnutrition as the cause. He needed us to succeed where she had failed. We weren't his children anymore. We were the final phase of his experiment. He was trying to rewrite history by perfecting the ritual that had destroyed his own family. When Leah's infection worsened, the choice became clear: either reveal the location of the hidden documents and face his wrath, or watch her deteriorate beyond recovery. But I knew that if I gave him the real location, he'd destroy the evidence, so I lied. I told him they were hidden in the garage. While he tore the space apart, I bought us time. As punishment for my deception, he forced Mom to pre-chew raw meat. The danger was obvious. The flesh was dark, slippery with blood. But he insisted that raw food preserved more enzymes, that cooking destroyed the molecular bonds necessary for family unity. Mom sat there, eyes unfocused, chewing mechanically. Her mouth moved out of obligation, not thought. Jonah found more in Dad's medical files, records confirming that as a child, Dad had been hospitalized for the same feeding practices his mother had imposed on him. It was all a cycle, generations of obsession, each parent convinced they could succeed where the last had failed. But Jonah found something else, too, proof of insurance fraud. Dad had been billing for therapy sessions that never took place, creating a trail of deception we could use. A small win, but something. When the health department scheduled a follow-up visit, we were hopeful. But Dad arranged it during his vacation week, knowing the inspector was a longtime golf buddy, a man who owed him for legal advice. This wasn't part of some grand conspiracy, just one man pulling favors. Personal corruption. No deeper than a dinner bill. The inspector arrived exactly on time. Dad served tea and launched into a presentation about cultural feeding practices, comparing our rituals to traditional communal eating customs from around the world. We sat silently nearby, hollowed out and pale. But to someone who had already decided what he would report, we were invisible. The inspector noted our weight loss, but said there was no clear evidence of immediate danger. Meanwhile, my old McDonald's manager hadn't stopped fighting. He kept calling different agencies trying to get someone to listen. But each time he was told the case had been reviewed, that parents had the right to raise children as they saw fit, as long as it wasn't violent. The law didn't know what to do with psychological abuse framed as religious freedom. In my library research, I discovered something heartbreaking. CPS couldn't legally intervene without proof of physical harm. Malnutrition didn't count, not if food was technically being provided. Without visible bruises, no one cared. Our bleeding mouths, our starving bodies, our broken minds, all of it invisible. Aunt Clara reached out to a journalist who was investigating parental rights loopholes. The reporter was interested, deeply, but needed testimony, something we couldn't provide. Every phone call was monitored, every envelope opened before it left the house. When the journalist attempted a visit, disguised as a surveyor, Dad recognized her from the photo on her byline. He confronted her at the door and threatened to sue for defamation if she printed anything about our family. But we had more than just words. The photocopied records showed that Mom had always known the truth. She had documented everything: her mother-in-law's death, the preventable nature of it, the feeding practices that led to it. She had stayed, hoping her presence could blunt the worst of Dad's beliefs. Her sacrifice gave us evidence, but it also cost us the only adult who might have protected us. Now she was too broken to speak at all. Meanwhile, Leah's iPod Shuffle, the one she kept hidden in her retainer case, contained hours of Dad's late-night monologues. In one of them, he confessed that his mother had chosen death rather than abandon the feeding ritual. He talked about finding her body, about how she refused to eat alone, even as her body failed. He believed we could redeem her, that we could prove her death meant something. As I organized the evidence, a pattern emerged.
Dad didn't just abuse us, he erased the proof that it was happening. He built elaborate forgeries, faked lesson plans, fabricated therapy logs, filed insurance claims for sessions no one attended, crafted documents for schooling that never occurred. A paper world of lies, covering the reality he refused to face.
But in the end, it was Dad's own obsessive documentation that became his downfall. Every forgery, every fabricated bill, every false report created a trail he couldn't erase. The paper fortress he'd built turned into a trap of his own making. We prepared for a final escape. "I can't believe the inspector just ignored everything because he plays golf with your dad," Jonah whispered one night, bitter. Leah clutched her iPod tight. Its hidden recordings, her quiet rebellion, now our most powerful evidence. We had it all: the photocopied documents, the forged bills, the hours of voice recordings. It was all there, if only the right people could be made to look at the right things at the right time. Dad could charm almost anyone, but not everyone at once. He couldn't explain away everything at the same time. We just had to endure long enough for the moment to arrive. The documents Mom had hidden showed she knew. She had recorded everything: Dad's obsession, his mother's preventable death, and his desire to rebuild the ritual that had failed her. She stayed, believing she could protect us from the worst of it. She gave us the key, but it cost her everything. One recording from Leah's iPod caught Dad during a late-night monologue, unaware she was awake. "She chose death over unity," he murmured during a late-night monologue. "But I'll show them. I'll show them it works." I realized then that Mom's silence had been strategic, a sacrifice, so we could gather what we needed. Dad filed homeschool transcripts, forging our signatures and assigning us top grades in imaginary subjects. Jonah discovered more insurance fraud, billing therapy sessions we never received. The pattern was undeniable. He created a false narrative while destroying every piece of the truth. So, we made our move. Aunt Clara arranged a surprise visit with a social worker, a nurse, and a sheriff simultaneously. Dad couldn't manage them all at once. We were ready. We showed them everything: the weight loss, the mouth sores, the infections. Physical proof they couldn't ignore. Dad tried to fight back with more medical paperwork, but the nurse recognized the letterhead from her own hospital. It was a forgery. Then the dentist Dad had recruited to vouch for him, but admitted under pressure that he'd never actually examined any of us. The professional courtesy agreement unraveled on the spot. The sheriff ordered an emergency removal. Dad demanded a warrant. That's when Leah handed over her iPod. A tech expert authenticated the recordings: Dad's voice, his confession, his rationalizations, his guilt. The case came into focus: Mother's gradual collapse, our documented resistance, Dad's spiraling control. His own records proved the abuse better than we ever could. When confronted, he broke down, not in denial, but in heartbreak. He genuinely believed the feeding chain could have saved his mother if done correctly. The prosecutor offered him a plea deal, mental health treatment in exchange for immediate relinquishment of custody. He accepted, convinced he'd regain custody eventually. He didn't know criminal charges were already pending. We were placed with Aunt Clara. The first step was survival. Emergency treatment began for infections, malnutrition, and trauma. Leah and I were skeletal. Jonah's fever returned. The community response was divided. Some ashamed they hadn't seen it, others angry they hadn't interfered. My old McDonald's manager was praised as a hero. Dad's golf buddies were quietly dropped from social circles. I began trauma therapy. Eating alone was terrifying at first, but I was recovering. I kept the plastic spoon in a box under my bed, a symbol of the moment I remembered I was still mine. Permanent restraining orders were granted. Mom was admitted into an inpatient recovery center that specialized in trauma. Her body was frail, her spirit all but extinguished. But slowly, very slowly, her voice returned. Dad's law license was suspended, pending review. The insurance fraud charges stuck. The alternative therapist was charged for practicing without a license. The dentist lost his hospital privileges for falsifying records. The health inspector who filed the original report faced internal review. His supervisor uncovered a pattern of favorable outcomes for several of Dad's clients. Jonah's untreated strep infection had reached his heart. He needed surgery. Leah required extensive dental reconstruction from the damage done during the pliers incident and all the infections that followed.
I still flinch at mealtime sometimes. I work with therapists who specialize in food-related trauma. We're healing, slowly, together. Mom's recovery remains the slowest. Years of malnutrition and psychological control left deep scars. She moved into a trauma-focused assisted living center. And one day, sitting in a sunlit room filled with quiet, she spoke to me. I didn't protect you the way I should have, but you protected each other, and you got out.
At first, Mom spoke in single words, then short phrases. She couldn't eat solid food for months. Dad's psychiatric evaluation revealed a diagnosis: delusional disorder, somatic type. He truly believed the feeding chain was medically necessary. His mother's death had triggered a psychotic break decades earlier. The court ordered long-term treatment at a secure psychiatric facility. Our return to school required extensive documentation. The forged homeschool records complicated everything. We were enrolled behind grade level due to educational neglect. With the help of tutors and continued medical care, we slowly began to catch up. Aunt Clara's house became our sanctuary. She installed locks on the kitchen cabinets, not to keep us out, but to help us feel the food was protected, safe. We ate at the table, using forks and spoons. The sound of metal on ceramic felt strange at first, unfamiliar, foreign. Jonah's girlfriend visited during his recovery, but their relationship didn't survive. She couldn't understand why he hadn't run, why he stayed. He understood, and grieved anyway. For her, for himself, for the normal he'd never really known. The CPS worker who had accepted Dad's forged documents was reassigned. Her supervisor discovered she had been buried in cases, often reviewing documents for just minutes at a time. Her oversight became part of a broader investigation into systemic failures within the county's child welfare division. Leah learned to eat again using her reconstructed teeth. Each meal took effort, careful chewing, jaw exercises, sometimes pain. She communicated through writing when speaking hurt too much. Her self-taught sign language became essential during recovery. I would back to McDonald's briefly, hoping for familiarity, but the smell triggered panic attacks. My old manager understood and offered me a reference letter for a job in retail instead. Folding clothes felt safer than serving food. Then Dad's side of the family came forward. His siblings shared stories of similar trauma. 2 uncles struggled with lifelong eating disorders. An aunt hadn't spoken to him in over 20 years after fleeing their mother's control. The cycle had always been there. He wasn't the start, just the next link. Mom's notebook became key evidence in the criminal trial. Her handwritten entries proved premeditation, that Dad had known the harm he caused. Her notes charted the slow escalation of abuse, the logic he used to justify it. Her sacrifice finally had weight. The insurance fraud alone carried a 5-year sentence. The forged medical records added 3 more. Child endangerment brought charges for each of us. If convicted on all counts, Dad faced decades in prison. But with a plea deal, he was committed to psychiatric treatment instead. We testified via video. None of us could face him in person. Leah used a sign language interpreter. Jonah's testimony had to be paused twice so he could rest. I spoke carefully, my voice shaking. Mom watched from her care facility, silent, her eyes wet but steady. The courtroom was nearly empty. No media frenzy, no headlines. Just a local reporter covering another criminal case. Our tragedy stayed personal, quiet, unnoticed beyond the people it scarred. No new laws were passed, no reforms sparked, no public outrage. Dad was sent to a facility 2 hours away. We never visited. Monthly reports said he continued to insist the feeding chain would have worked if only he'd done it perfectly. Medication helped calm the delusions, but not the underlying belief. Recovery looked like learning life all over again. How to buy groceries, how to cook simple meals, how to eat alone without shame or guilt. We worked with therapists, individually and together. Progress came slowly, in quiet wins. Leah's first solo meal was applesauce. She cried as she ate it alone in her room, door locked for privacy. Jonah managed soup after weeks of nothing but shakes. I started with crackers. Eventually, I could make a sandwich. Mom remained on a feeding tube for months. Her body needed time to relearn how to accept nourishment safely. The house was sold. Legal fees, medical debt, and the cost of recovery took everything. Dad's law practice dissolved. His clients found new lawyers. His spotless reputation disappeared. No scandal, just silence. He
He faded from the professional world he once ruled. We started attending a support group for cult survivors. Our experience wasn't religious, but the patterns were the same. Isolation, control, twisted logic disguised as love. We were finally among people who understood. People who didn't ask why we didn't just leave. Aunt Clara became Leah's legal guardian until she turned 18. Jonah aged out of the system but stayed in Aunt's home. I rented a small apartment near community college. We gathered every week for dinner, practicing what a family should feel like. 6 months in, Mom graduated to soft foods. She held her spoon, trembling, and smiled.
Her first independent bite was mashed potatoes. She ate alone in her room. A nurse checked on her every hour. Each meal was logged, each small improvement quietly celebrated. Bite by bite, she came back to herself. Speech therapy helped her find her voice again. Words returned, slowly, like sprouting seeds after a long winter. Dad's mother's death certificate was officially amended. Originally listed as natural causes, it was changed after an investigation revealed a pattern of medical neglect. It was too late for justice, but not too late for the truth to be recorded. Dad hadn't started the cycle. He was just another link in a long chain of inherited harm. 1 year later, he remained in the psychiatric facility. The fraud convictions barred him from ever practicing law again. Mom continued her recovery in the trauma-focused assisted living facility. Her progress was slow but steady. We, her children, kept going. Therapy continued. So did healing. Jonah's infections finally cleared. Leah completed her dental reconstruction. Her smile was different now. Fragile, but real. Family meals became something new. We picked restaurants together. We ordered what we wanted. We used utensils. No pressure. No ritual. Just food. And choice. I still remember Leah sobbing quietly over her applesauce. And Jonah, sipping soup slowly, his hands trembling but steady. Heartbreaking and hopeful. That's what healing looks like.